We're in the minor prophets at Lakewoods Drive this quarter, and I made mention of the fact that there's going to be far too much in several, well, probably most of these books for me to get through in the allotted time. And so, what I'm probably going to do is spend some time here on Sunday afternoons talking about the things that got left out. I don't know if I'm going to do that every single week for the next, whatever it is, 12, 13 weeks, but it'll happen more than once, I strongly suspect. And we're going to start with Hosea, where we were last week. I wanted to fill in some gaps with regard to the imagery and the parallels that we see in the book of Hosea regarding his interactions with his people, and especially with regard to the way that he would perfect his relationship with his people in Jesus. And let me back up a little bit to talk about God and creation in general with regard to humanity. From the very beginning, the purpose of mankind was to fear God and keep his commandments, to jump ahead a few thousand years to what the preacher says in Ecclesiastes 12:13. That's what Adam and Eve were supposed to do. That's what every human being that's ever been born since then has been supposed to do. We are required to serve God in this life. And when we do so in trusting in obedient faith, our Father is pleased with us and he blesses us. That's a very broad depiction of this process. But that's generally how it's worked, how it's always worked. And also how it's always worked is that we have underachieved. We as human beings have not been what we should have been. We have fallen short. That was grotesquely displayed in the days of Noah when God was moved to destroy the entire earth and start all over again. But it's really that way with every human being. Every single one of us has fallen short like this. And it served God's purposes in the days of Abraham to come to his creation and say, I'm going to grab a particular family descended from Abraham here. I'm going to take that family and I'm going to turn it into a nation, and I'm going to show in that nation what I expect out of my people, out of humanity in general. And Abraham and his family were chosen, of course, because Abraham was a remarkable example of faith. Not a perfect example by any means, but a remarkable example. And God said, I'm going to blow this up and make this big and show in this family of Israel that would come up, what it means to be my child, what it means to be my servant. And so starting with Jacob and his family coming out of Egypt, ultimately populating the land of Canaan, this is God interacting with his people and blessing his people. This is where the nation of Israel comes from. And eventually that leads us to the book of Hosea. And I don't want to get into a big background story with regard to Hosea, but Hosea is prophesying to the part of the nation that is still called Israel. Most of the tribes broke off in the days of Jeroboam and Rehoboam to form a new nation that was not really devoted to the line of David in the most literal of senses, but really wasn't devoted to God, is the real problem. And they are showing themselves to be inadequate, showing themselves to be subpar, not what God expected. And as a result, Hosea writes this prophecy to condemn the people of God and chasten them and bring them to a greater appreciation for what their service ought to look like. And there is some allusion in Hosea, not maybe as much as Isaiah or some other places, but there are allusions nevertheless to this perfected reality that was going to be coming in the distant future. That God would use this imperfect model of service, this imperfect model of submission, to bring into the world the perfect model, the one who would actually accomplish God's purposes perfectly, serve God's purposes perfectly in this life. And of course, we know that person as Jesus Christ. Isaiah plays with this idea a lot. The idea of the servant that would come into the world at some point that would accomplish God's purposes. These servant songs that we see in chapter 42 rather, 44, 49, especially 53. We see this building sense of accomplishment, of fulfillment, that God wants his servant to go out and perform in a certain way. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But there's always this vision. There's always this accomplished reality in the mind of God himself, what service would look like. And ultimately you get to chapter 53 and you see this perfect individual come up. He's called the servant. And he's not what people looked for. He's not what people especially wanted to be or wanted to value or whatever. But God is approving this. And when we see that sort of imagery all over the place, David, when he's called to be king, we see that he's looking for a man after his own heart, etc. That's what God wants out of us, out of all of us. And Israel should teach this lesson to us. And certainly Israel should learn this lesson from God, but they're mixed results at best with regard to that. Let's just leave it at that. Hosea is given to us so as to condemn the people's poor action, and also very subtly, a lot more subtly than you see in Isaiah, to hold up this perfect example. And we'll get to that in a second. But what I'd like to do is back up to chapter 4 in Hosea and look at the way that Israel is portrayed in the text. And I want us to see not just the imperfection of what Israel had been doing, not just in Hosea's day, but really throughout their history. See that and contrast it with what Jesus does for God, who I'm calling here the perfect Israelite. All the things that God expected out of Israel, all the things that God expected out of his servants, and really out of humanity in general, and each individual person in humanity. All of those things, everything God wanted out of people, Jesus did. And Israel didn't do. And of course, you and I are going to fall short here also. So this is a celebration of Jesus and how he is able to accomplish these things and show us a model of behavior far better than Israel, of course, so that we can follow after him and please God in our service and have God's favor showered down upon us. God showered favor upon Israel generation after generation, even though they were underachieving. Those who maintained their faith, who tried to do service as God had expected. They weren't perfect at all, but they were trying. Men like Hezekiah and Josiah and Jehoshaphat and others as well. Men and women alike found a way to draw close to God in these moments. And we can do the same thing. And through the grace that's available in Jesus Christ, our best effort, whatever that might be, is good enough. Because Jesus is good enough, and because he is able to serve perfectly in the flesh, we don't have to be perfect in the flesh. We strive for perfection, but we do not we do not come upon God's wrath because we are somewhat less than perfect, which, thankfully that's the case. Chapter 4 and verse number 1, hear the word of the Lord, people of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land, against the Israelites. There is no truth, no faithful love, and no knowledge of God in the land. Okay, well, here we have some basic things. There was no truth. Well, obviously there was some truth, but the idea of truly embodying what honesty and fairness and righteousness is in this life, Israel wasn't doing that. And it's no accident that Jesus is described as being the one through whom grace and truth were realized. John 1 verse 17 tells us that. We see the very epitome of truth. Nothing that he said, nothing he did not, that he did was not true. Everything was absolutely as it should have been. There was no deceit found in his mouth, we're told in 1 Peter chapter 2. In this description of his perfect example, we don't get a lot of specifics about that, but one we do get is no deceit was found in his mouth. He was perfect in his speech. He is the faithful one, the faithful love, the chesed, pardon my very poor Hebrew, that we see over and over again in the Old Testament, this faithful love or loving kindness, or different versions are going to translate it different ways. The idea that God connects emotionally and personally to his creation throughout time. No matter what we are doing, he loves us at all times. He is merciful to us at all times. Sometimes we are not worthy of that, and sometimes we fall out of his grace, and that's a whole other story there. But the idea of faithful love, the love that God showed by sending Jesus to the cross in the first place. Jesus shows this faithful love that we should all be having for God. He has that for God, and he has it for us also. In that way, he demonstrates what God's love looks like. If you want to know what God is in any way, and particularly with regard to faithful love, to loving kindness, we see Jesus. We see him mourning over Jerusalem, wishing to gather the Israelites under his wings like a hen would gather her chicks, and they just were unwilling to do that. It breaks Jesus' heart because he is the embodiment of faithful love. And certainly the idea of the knowledge of God here. Jesus is perfect in his knowledge of God because he is God in the flesh. He reveals God fully. Everything that we need to know, everything that we can know about God, we see in the person of Jesus Christ because he is a partaker of God. I and the Father are one. John chapter 10, I think it's verse 30, he says there. And that has profound meaning all over the place. But what it essentially means in a nutshell is when God speaks and I speak, we're on the same page. We agree with each other fully. Everything that God wants, I want. Everything that God is pursuing, everything God values, etc. Those are the things that I value because he has that connection to God, that full connection, that full knowledge of God. He does not require us to educate him in such matters. He is the wonderful counselor that Isaiah alludes to in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7. That is should be a tremendous confidence builder for us because all we have to do is look to Jesus, and then that full message that God has for us is revealed in him. That's what the Hebrew writer is talking about. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 says that in these last days he's revealed to us through his Son. There were, divers in various times in divers manners, the text says there in I think the Old King James, that God revealed smatterings of himself in one fashion or another, in burning bushes and et cetera, and certainly through the law of Moses. But everything that truly matters, everything that certainly pertains to us in our lives, is revealed to us through Jesus Christ. Notice also in verse number 2, cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery are rampant. One act of bloodshed follows another. This is the broad brush painting, as it were, of what Israel was like. The idea of impurity and unrighteousness and violence and slander, the things that characterize us when we chase after the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the pride of life. Israel did it too. And we do it now. Jesus didn't. At no point did Jesus do any of these things. He knew no sin again. And that's not just because he was able to make better decisions in the moment or whatever. It's because he does not value such things. He said that the devil is coming after him and he has nothing in me. And what that means, I think, is that there is no regret. There are no second thoughts. There are no, well, I really wish I could go out and fornicate. I really wish that I could go out and steal things, but God wouldn't let me do that. And so I'm going to make a deliberate choice and exercise some self-control and stay on the right side of these moral choices, etc. I never saw The Last Temptation of Christ, the Martin Scorsese film, but supposedly that's what this was all about. Jesus making this really, really tough choice there toward the end of his life and choosing to say no. That's not what happened with Jesus. Jesus did not have these things in his heart. He was not given over to these things on an emotional level, on a mental, spiritual level, and so therefore it never manifested itself in the flesh. That is the result when we look at the fruit of the Spirit that Paul writes about in Galatians chapter 5. When we have all of these noble things growing in us, they render us neither useless nor unfruitful, the text says in 2 Peter chapter 1 in the Christian graces passage there. When we do God's things, when we put God's things in our heart, when we put his treasure in us, we store up treasures in heaven instead of on the earth, Matthew 6, 19, 20, 21. That transforms us into the kind of people that we should be at all times, the kind of person that Jesus was at all times. That's who he is by his very nature, who all of God's servants should be. Now, again, as we mentioned before, that is a very idealized target for us to shoot for. And I don't care to get into a big discussion about whatever advantages Jesus might have had because he was the Son of God, etc. The point that we get over and over again is a very practical one. This is who God is, and this is what God wants. Jesus shows us that, both of those things at the very same moment. And so we aspire to be like Jesus. We get to where, hopefully at least, conceptually, at least. Galatians 2 verse 20, we're crucified with Christ. It's no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. That's what we're looking for. And maybe Paul's presenting a kind of idealized version even of himself, and certainly an idealized version of Christianity. But that's what we strive for. That's what we are trying to do. And by God's grace, we will achieve better than we have in times past. And God is certainly merciful to us. 1 John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 talk about that, how these things I have written to you that you may not sin. And if anyone does sin, we have an advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous. That is a blessing to us, not just to keep us away from sin, but also to show us mercy when we do sin. Now, skip ahead a little bit to chapter 11 and verse 1. And this is, I think, the only passage in Hosea that's specifically designated as being messianic. I could be wrong on that. But it's one of the very first messianic prophecies and one of the biggest head scratchers, at least on the surface, where Matthew refers to this flight of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus to Egypt, and then their return to Israel so that it would be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. And that's a quotation from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And we say, in the first place, that seems like a, kind of a manufactured prophecy. It didn't really sound like much of a prophecy at all. And then you're saying that he took a trip to Egypt and therefore the prophecy was fulfilled. That seems, kind of fake, as it were. Well, if you don't understand the bigger principles, the bigger concepts of the role of Israel, the role of Christ in the world, then maybe it might seem that way. But when you look at the bigger picture and you look at what being called out of Egypt was all about, this is going back to Jacob's family, going back to the days of Moses, how God has in fact designated this nation. You are my son, my firstborn, several times in the Old Testament. Israel is called God's son, God's child. And he has begotten this child so that this child can walk in his image, that the child can pursue his things, be a good son, be a good servant. And he has empowered the nation. He's given it identity at the Mount Sinai. He has given it a law. And now eventually he's going to give them the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob way back in the day. And in this place, ensconced in the blessings of God, Israel is empowered to be the servant, to be God's representative here on earth, as it were. That is the objective. That's what we're supposed to be striving for. They were supposed to be striving for. That's why they were called out of Egypt in the first place. And you see Egypt referred to many, many places, including in Hosea, as the epitome of slavery, of degradation, of what was before we knew God, before God reached out to us with his grace. We were called out of Egypt. And that same thing is true for us in the modern day. Whether you've ever been to Egypt or not, whether you've ever been actually enslaved or not, the important thing is that God has called you out of this previous state. You were enslaved to sin, if nothing else. And he has elevated you to his family. You are his child. He's called you out of Egypt. And because you're called out of Egypt, the expectation is you're going to live this new life in service to God. That's what Romans chapter 6 is talking about, that we're born again, as it were, in Jesus. We're buried with Jesus in baptism and raised up to walk in newness of life. This is a new category of existence for us. Jesus shows that by being called out of Egypt, as it were. Now, he himself was not brought out of sin, of course, but he was brought out of Egypt, literally, just like the nation was. And again, this may be the most perfect example of this parallel between Jesus' life and the life of the nation of Israel. Jesus is designated for a purpose, just like the nation was. The nation did not fulfill this purpose very well. Jesus is going to fulfill it perfectly. And all these downfalls that you see about Israel. Israel called you the Egyptians even as Israel was leaving them. Verse number 2, they kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering burnt offerings to idols. And on. It goes on to talk about how from the very beginning, Israel began to underachieve. Israel was not the called out people that they should have been. Jesus is. And so we don't look to Israel for salvation. We look to Jesus for salvation, our perfect model. And we'll close up with a passage in chapter 14 as the text completes itself here. That there is hope for us. There is resurrection for us. If we will take this model of behavior, if we will be what Israel was always supposed to be, if we will be what Jesus was. And not all of the minor prophets are as deliberate and forthright about this message of reconciliation as Hosea is. But in this bigger picture of the Hosea passage, the Hosea story, him and his estranged wife and the way that she let him down, and he is reaching out to her and bringing her back. This is what God does for his people, the mercy that he shows, that he wants to show for us. Look in chapter 14 and verse number 4. I will, and this go back to verse number 1, Israel, return to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled in your iniquity. This is God's call. Come back to me, he says. Be the child, be the servant that I want you to be, that you presumably want to be yourself. Verse number 4, this is what God will do. I will heal their apostasy. I will freely love them, for my anger will be turned from him. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like the lily and take root like the cedars of Lebanon. His new branches will spread, and his splendor will be like the olive tree, his fragrance like the forests of Lebanon. The people will return and live beneath his shade. They will grow grain and blossom like the vine. His renown will be like the wine of Lebanon. Ephraim, why should I have anything more to do with idols? It is I who answer and watch over him. I am like a flourishing pine tree. Your fruit comes from me. Let whoever is wise understand these things, and whoever is insightful recognize them, for the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. You'd be hard-pressed to find any passage that describes righteous, godly behavior, servant behavior, better than this last verse in Hosea chapter 14 here. This is what righteous people will do. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous are going to walk in them. This is who we are. This is what we have always been intended to do with our life. The only mission that you have of any consequence in this life is to find the ways of God and walk in them like Jesus did, following after your perfect example. Be a righteous soul. Be a righteous servant. Most people are not going to do that. We ourselves are not going to do that all the time, unfortunately. But we have the blessing of knowing that God is rooting for us, that Jesus has died on the cross for us, and that we have an opportunity to elevate our status by his power, not by our own, but elevate our status to the status of child, not just servant, but child in the house of God, recipient of every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places here on earth, at least every one that he has to bestow on us here on earth, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3, withholding from us only the blessings of eternity, and those are going to be ours too, in due course of time, if we persevere, if we walk and do not faint, as it were, if we continue to serve as Jesus did. Be faithful until death, and I'll give you the crown of life, Jesus says in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. That can and will be your fate if you will serve God, if you'll commit to serving God as Jesus did. And thank God for the example and the perfection of Jesus that leads us in the paths of righteousness. I love the book of Hosea. I hope that it's a blessing to you. I hope that you can learn the lessons there that he has for us about sin and about defilement and about reconciliation and about hope for those ones who are committed to doing God's things in their life. That is the service that you were born to render to God. And with God's help, we'll be able to do exactly that. Thank you very much for following along. I hope that this is a blessing to you. I hope that you can be the kind of servant, the kind of, if you will, Israelite that God has intended for you to be for the rest of your life. Thanks a lot, and God bless.